Welcome to Stop Overthinking, the podcast for overthinkers, people pleasers, and perfectionists who want to feel calm and confident enough to handle whatever life sends your way. I'm your host, Kristen Odegaard, a women's life and mindset coach, lifelong educator, and recovering perfectionist. Welcome back to the Stop Overthinking podcast. I am excited to introduce you to a guest today. We have Kyira Wackett coming with us to talk about shame and burnout and anxiety. She is a licensed therapist and focuses on those elements. So, Kyira, thank you for being with us today. And please tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm super excited. I think the sentiment of just your podcast name just completely fits with what I do and kind of how I try to support people. I would say every day somebody asks that question of give a little bit more of a background. I feel like it changes based on what's like the most in your face. And so right
Yes.
now I would say that I am a mom, a business owner, a partner, and in this place of evolution of figuring out, not just in those roles, but all these other roles in my life, who I want to be versus who I continue to still feel a pressure to be. And so I I think like a lot of people that come into the helping profession have gone through my own experiences with some complex trauma, going through an eating disorder, some sort of painful identity pieces, and had a lot of shame. Just a lot of what I went through had built a story in me that I was either the problem or I was responsible for making sure that there was no problem. So, whatever that looked like, taking care of everybody else around me. And I've worked
Mhm.
really hard to undo that. And I think in my work, it's a lot of naming that and supporting people in that process. And I am recognizing that, and that's really where I've shifted from talking about sort of shame and recovering from shame, absolving shame, but really just shame resilience and realizing
Mhm.
that resilience is about recognizing I'm always going to feel these things. It's the depth and the control that I give it. And so as I think about that question, who am I right now? What am I doing? I am still all of those things. I am working really hard to support the people in my life to own their story while I'm learning what the next phase of owning mine really looks like.
I love that. Yes. And I can absolutely relate about owning my story and
Mhm.
helping others move to that next stage as well. So, we're going to talk about some maybe heavier kinds of things today, but I think it's something that all of my listeners and all women, especially, are really struggling with. But just so that we have a common language and terminology to get us started,
Yeah.
let's start with burnout. And this is a word that we've heard so much about in the last couple of years. Uh, Let's start with what is it in your mind?
Yeah. So I talk about burnout as a spectrum of an experience. A lot of people have gotten confused, I think, because of how much the word's been used, that it's a formal diagnosis. It's not. Burnout is an experience that we have. And so I think about it like if zero is everything is amazing. I feel completely charged in all aspects of my life. I never feel like I have to do more, be more, say something different. I'm never ruminating. I'm never pressured. That's a zero. And then 100 is I'm so burnt out. I've got major depressive disorder. I can't get out of bed. I'm coping through some sort of addiction, very extreme. The rest of us live in a 1 to 99% swing at all points in time. I have never met a zero. And I have met people at that 100 point that are in severe needs for treatment. The majority of us and what these articles and all of these shows and these programs are being targeted to is the people in the 1 to 99. And what that looks like for each of us is different. And so what we think about with burnout is it's essentially the idea that you get to a place that you can no longer function in all of your roles without feeling foggy, I was going to say burnt out in the burnout, left behind in some way. You can't keep up. The stories in your head are getting louder than the actions that you're able to do. You're kind of stuck in that negative framework. There's main components of it. And I think the two key pieces when we feel burnout are we have compassion fatigue, which is essentially I've cared too much for too many for too long. So you start to almost become resentful of the people that aren't showing up for you, of the person who never stays late at work, of the kid who can't just realize how grateful they should be because of all the things that you do for them. And you start to become apathetic. So you start to feel like, what's the point? Why do I try? Nothing is ever going to get better. And mixed in that is all of these different symptoms: physical, mental, emotional. You might notice that you're more irritable, you're tired all the time, feel like you're constantly ready to cry, or anytime you get in a car, if somebody looks at you the wrong way, your road rage gets activated. And so you just start to notice the depth of that coming through. Now, as I'm describing this, again, I still want people to think about it as a spectrum. So at a 1, I might feel like, hardly ever annoyed. And like most days, I feel like I go to bed and I'm like, I feel pretty good. Got most of those things taken care of. My worth is not defined by how much I do, all the way up to whatever your point is. Now, I am not a 99. When I'm at like a 30, I am burnt out. That is my sort of endpoint. I start to feel like I can't move fast enough to keep up with my thoughts, with the pressures, with other people. So, as people are hearing this, I would say burnout is your subjective experience. And it's some point that you get to where you no longer feel like you are able to move through your life in a mindful pace. You are either stuck in the past or perseverating on your future. And when those things happen, you are not able to show up in your day without feeling overwhelmed.
Yes, and I love the fact that you talked about even that your level of burnout where you start to feel that
Yeah.
is like at a 30, and
Yeah.
just for people to recognize, because it's so easy to fall into that comparison trap, even of
Yes.
seeing what other people are doing and feeling like I should be doing more, and you keep pushing and pushing and pushing. Why are we hearing more about burnout now than we did, say, 5, 10 years ago? It just seems like it's really become this buzzword, like we
Yeah.
said. But why is that, do you think?
Well, so I think there's two factors. One, research was only really ever done on burnout in a workplace setting, particularly sort of corporate burnout. And so if you think about the workplace, most of that was done on white men in jobs and looking at what burnout looks like in high powered, high energy, high demand jobs. We saw some research that looked at burnout on a more global level, but most of it was really specific around, basically, it's people at these jobs. If they're lawyers, doctors, they're doing these things, they're getting burnt out because they're doing so much. The problem there then is, I think that burnout became something we quantified. It's for people that work this many hours. It's for people that do this many things. It's for people at this level of education. So there was a degree, almost like a checklist. And then we started sort of self diagnosing. And if we weren't, quote unquote, as bad or doing as much as someone else, we weren't allowed to feel burnt out. So there was, I think, this first part, which is just segmented research and not realizing that burnout is a human experience, not a product of a work environment. But then second, I think what happened is, with the pandemic is when burnout kind of came out even more. What is interesting is to look out that burnout is still talked about of like, well, you feel this way, here's how to fix it, which is really just hustle culture in sheep's clothing, saying get your shit together and work harder. And so for many people, I do a lot of work in corporate settings. I do a lot of work with individual clients. The burnout propagation is around the culture that we exist in, where we
Mhm.
fear that if we take a day off, I'm a solopreneur. I have feared that if I take a day off from doing X, canceling a client, not taking on this extra project, not being the yes person to everything that everybody wants, my business is going to fail. When I used to be on social media, it was the same thing. If you don't post every day, you're not relevant.
Mhm.
And so the burnout culture is really still a propagation of doing more culture. And
Yes.
in that has been this comparison piece
Mhm.
of, we're validating sort of that everything is hard. We did it right as we were, I don't even know where we're at in the stage of the pandemic. I feel like post pandemic doesn't fit, but we're not in the isolation period in the same way. But we talked about, you might feel a little bit burnt out being around other people. You might feel like it's really hard to tackle all these things on your own. I was a mom to a newborn when the pandemic happened. Figuring out how to do that, I was burnt out and I never left my house. But
Mhm.
nobody was really talking about how burnout was really our body's response to being in a state of long term stress and pressure. And that
Mhm.
the experience of burnout was basically a result of thinking, I'm not in a position I can do enough. I don't actually have a right to address my trauma. Instead, I'm supposed to be baking sourdough and reorganizing my closet and starting a new business and thriving as a mom because now I've got all of the time in the world to do this. And if I'm not, again, this sort of messaging was something is wrong with me. And the messaging around sort of the media was still figure your shit out and work harder. And so I think we're hearing more of it because people want to change the conversation. I think we're still not being totally honest that burnout is a cultural problem, that
Mhm.
we need to shift busyness culture by way of shifting our shame stories individually and collectively to not feel like our worth and value is based on what we do or how much money we make or the output, again, either as an individual or a collective.
Yes. And now I'm intrigued. So tell me more about shame stories because we do get caught up in this hustle culture and there's all this comparison. It's really become normalized in a sense to just push through the crap and
Yeah.
keep going. But there's underlying issues and shame being one of them. So more about that.
Yeah. So basically, think about from the time that we're born, we need basic things to survive. We know that we need water, we need food, we need shelter. We need connection and belonging at the same level that we need those other things. So when we're born, our brains as infants are already trying to figure out how do I secure safety? How do I belong? How do I get my needs met? And so obviously when we're very little, it's crying, it's these things we don't fully understand it, but we start to become conditioned by the people around us of the behaviors we should, quote unquote, do and the things we shouldn't. As you get a little bit older, primarily, I think more about like elementary school, middle school, but it's happening even before that. We're getting messages about what's right, what's wrong, what's good, what's bad, what's expected of us. And oftentimes, love, opportunity, connection is all based on how well we perform. So we can think of kind of easy things like I had A's in school. I was treated very differently from a friend of mine that got C's and D's in schools. The things that I got away with, the ways that I was talked to by my teachers, very different than their experience and the track that they were put on in their life just based on how they performed in this one area. For many of us, we can think about our parents or caregivers, the way that they responded to us when we did something and how they responded. I still think about a time when I was living with my aunt where she was so inconvenienced that I was having a negative emotion. I was having a lot of pain. And she basically told me to put a smile on my face because it wasn't helpful for her because she had a party she was hosting that night. And so those little messages, and we do it to other people, but it's the ways that we basically become conditioned that says, oh, I can feel this way. I can't feel that way. Or if I feel this way, this is how I have to respond. And if we layer in gender, race, socioeconomic status, body size, there's
Mhm.
different rules that we start to develop. This person is good. This person is bad. This person is beautiful. This person is not. This person is safe. This person isn't. And we start to basically create these boxes. And our goal is to be on the side of good, safe, better, beautiful, whatever it is, because then we can secure connection and belonging. So shame basically gets birthed out of that. Those rules are our basically our basis for our belief about ourselves. I am only going to be worthy, lovable, accepted if I do and become X, Y, and Z. If I act this way, shame basically shows up because we start to become afraid that we can't meet all those expectations. Can't do it all. What if we miss the mark on something? What if one day I wear the wrong outfit or I say the wrong thing or what if I gain weight or I talk out of turn? Whatever that is, shame is the fear of not belonging, of not being worthy. And so it's mixed very deeply with those rules and those beliefs that we have about ourselves. And it comes out of the woodwork basically saying, but I'll help you. So it's a
Mhm.
fear, but it tries to tell you if you just get back in line, perform a little bit better over here. Do a little bit more over here. Be the best in this area. Step over other people to get to the top. Then your connection will be secured. Then your worth and your value will be there. So, what ends up happening is we spend our whole lives chasing that idea of being enough or petrified we're going to lose it. We have no idea how to exist in the spectrum. There's only, yes, I'm good enough. No, I'm not. And we're hopping back and forth between those things. And so, if we're doing that our whole lives, what it looks like to be a good friend, what it looks like to be a good daughter, kid in any way, a good partner, a good employee or business owner, all of that gets rooted to those same things. These are
Mhm.
the rules. You have to do it and figure it out. And you're afforded no days off. You're afforded no downtime because let me remind you, and this is where shame comes in. Here's your threat. If you stop now, who's going to get ahead of you?
Mhm.
So it all becomes driven by a comparison and the belief that there's only room for certain people at the top of the mountain. Everybody else is going to be on the bottom. And if
Yeah.
you're down there and people see all of your shit that you've been trying to hide, there's no way that they're going to let you stay a part of the group.
Mhm. Mhm. How do you see that, for women in particular,
Mhm.
that shame festers for them? It be that, culturally or through gender roles. Where do you see that coming up?
I think there's obviously different responses for different people. What we know is that shame sort of manifests in three defenses. So when we feel shame or the threat of shame, we respond by either moving towards, which is people pleasing, taking care of everybody around you, sort of becoming in service. You actually make yourself small, but it's a power play. Because if you're needed by everybody, then of course they're going to keep you around.
Mhm.
The second is moving away, which is basically sort of a self preservation. It's like the person that makes a joke about their body before somebody else can because they're very insecure. And so they're like, I'm going to just sort of take myself out of this. I'm not going to let you hurt me. I'm going to safeguard that way. It's going to be maybe somebody that isolates a bit more, somebody that always feels like they're just a little bit more detached. Or something that we will end up doing if we are those moving towards those people pleasers and then we burn out and we're like, I can't respond to my texts, my emails, like the whole world is sort of shutting down for a moment. So we'll use it for a bit of respite. And then the third response is what's called moving against, which is basically saying, I don't think I can ever get to the top. So my only play that I have left is to bring everybody to the bottom with me.
Mhm.
What I see most often is that I think people who are raised socialized female, now I can only say this to the people that I've worked with and or my experience in the United States and the culture that we have here,
Sure.
is that the majority of women are conditioned to be that first bucket, the people pleasers. Their job becomes about being high performers. So most women that I work with identify as people pleasers and perfectionists. And there's this idea of, I think back to like resumes when I was in high school. It was an ideal to put it down that you could multitask, that you could manage
Right.
64 things at one time.
Mhm.
That's not an ideal. That's actually very unhealthy,
Mhm.
but that is a trait that you expected to see on a woman's resume.
Yes.
And so for a lot of us, it's that idea of my job is to be able to prove that I can handle it all and I don't waver and
Mhm.
everything will be fine. And the
Mhm.
expectation is that I'm doing 16 different roles at a time and managing them very well. And I've gotten really good at making my pain small. Now, some of that I think is messaging, particularly around, like, I think about when we get our periods. And then there's this notion of like, oh, you're PMSing, you're being too dramatic, you're doing this. It's like, oh, okay, my emotions are a problem. Stuff those down. Or when you start to develop and your hormones change and you're feeling something different, like some of that is sort of cultural messaging around like just basic development. But I think a lot of that is basically patriarchal roles and kind of when you mentioned gender roles, how women have been conditioned to be quote unquote useful in our culture. And so, we've all seen that. If you are assertive as a male, you're going to be seen as aggressive or bitchy as a woman. And so we've
Mhm.
gotten those ideas of, I have to find a different route to be good enough. And
Mhm.
so they end up taking that route with the caveat that I think we experience burnout there.
Mhm.
So we take it on, we take it on, we take it on. We're inching towards that 30, we're inching towards that 40, that 50. We're like, okay, the boat hasn't broke yet. I'll keep going. You get to a place where you implode and then you pick option 2 or 3. You either completely distance yourself, you isolate, you detach, you sort of numb out, which can be where things like emotional eating, binge watching TV, doom scrolling on social media, completely cutting off all your friends, not talking to anybody for a while happens. Or you go option 3, which is that now I'm just a bitch.
Yeah.
Now I just don't care. Now I'm
Mhm.
going to make you feel like shit because I am so resentful of the fact that you haven't seen me for so long. And
Mhm.
then we do that. And then whichever one we pick, 2 or 3, we end up feeling more shame because
Right.
now we're the asshole. So then we
Mhm.
go back to option 1 and we try it even harder. And it
Yeah.
becomes the cycle for the majority of women until they break that and they deal with some of those internalized stories and realize that those stories don't have to be theirs and that their worth is based on who they are, not what they do or how somebody else perceives them to be.
Yes. And I can speak from experience having been down that path and getting to the breaking point. And then I went to option 3,
Mhm.
turning into a bitch, but then feeling terrible that I would do that just occurs. And, we talked a little bit just the role of women, the socialization, patriarchy, whatever we want to say. And what came to mind was I follow somebody on Instagram that's always talking about invisible loads. And she will
Yes.
do it for everything from like planning a child's birthday party to
Uh-huh.
going on vacation or hosting Easter dinner or anything like that. And you don't realize just how much is there that isn't tangible, where you're
Yeah.
trying to balance everybody's schedules and wants and needs. And
Mhm.
again, in that caregiver role of trying to make it, my mom had different kinds of things, but I didn't see the same type of dynamics for all of the things that you talked about, right? We grew up this way. Now we've been socialized this way and here we are.
Well,
So,
and they had messages, but those messages came, it was like their parent or
mhm,
a caregiver from school or church or a peer
mhm,
group. We have social media and
right.
working with a lot of new moms, that's a conversation I have of,
Mhm,
yeah, because you're reminded every other moment that you should be making your toddler's yogurt. You
yes.
should be rotating their books. You should be planning this sensory activity and you should be excited to do all of those things. And your kids should be excited to do that while you're also still maintaining this perfectly clean house with these 6 items that if you
Mhm,
buy, then everything's gonna be amazing, and then here's this outfit you should be wearing because you should put yourself together more and take more
mhm,
pride in your experience, and all of that messaging gets dumped on us where I go, "If I'm gonna straighten my hair one morning, I am not making breakfast. That is a cereal morning. That is a
yeah.
conscious decision of knowing you either get me in a different outfit than sweats and an oversized sweatshirt with my hair done, or you get a homemade breakfast. You don't get both.
Right.
But the idea that we're supposed to be able to, again, that the multitasking,
Mhm,
the ability to layer on and layer on. And one of the coolest things, I wish I remember who taught me this. This was like 14, 15 years ago, where somebody gave an example of multitasking and they said, okay, count from 1 to 26 as fast as you can and I'll time you. So I did that. They timed me. Now do your ABCs as fast as you can and I'll time you. Did that. They time me. Let's say for the sake of this, it was 10 seconds each. So I could get through each one of them in 10 seconds flat. So then the idea would be that I can say both in 20 seconds. So then what they had me do is go back and forth and task switch. So 1, A, 2, B, 3, C. And they timed me to see how far I got in 20 seconds. And I got to like E or F. And the whole point of that was to say when you're constantly task switching and holding multiple roles at one time, you don't realize how much you're tasking your brain to do. And all of those tabs are open in the background. They are all taking up your energy, they are all taking up your space. And I think that's that invisible load that we're talking
right.
about. That is that piece. And we've made it so normal. My husband joked with me at one point years ago. I forget why it came up, but we were flying back. We were on an airplane, and I said something about feeling like almost like my friends got the better end of the deal. Like I thought I was a better friend than they were to me. I'm like, I'm always there. I'm probably not always, but like in
Yeah.
my head, I'm resentful, right? I'm bordering on that option 2 or 3. And he goes, you make it really easy for people to forget about you. And at first I was like, "You? What are you talking about? You're supposed to love me and care about me and be there at all points." But the more we talked about it, he's like, "Anytime someone asks you about you, you find a very natural and quick way to make it about them. Anytime that you have a need, you absorb that need for yourself. You don't ever ask for help. You don't ever allow somebody the opportunity to reject you because you're so afraid that could happen. So you just take it all on yourself and you've convinced yourself it's because you can handle it. Meanwhile, you're asking everyone and their mother what you can do to take care of them, just trying to squeeze it in. So it
Mhm.
isn't that people don't care, it's that you've literally conditioned them out of knowing how to be a friend for you.
Yeah.
So now when you have these expectations, they don't even know this is a thing that you need because
Mhm.
you've made it their normal not to have to think about you. And that was such an interesting thing. And I think something that many women can relate to. It
Yes.
sucks,
Mhm.
but it is a truth. And we've done it to preserve ourselves, to be okay in the world. But the reality is, then that means it ultimately is on us to then change that in our relationships, particularly with ourself, so we can shift it in our relationship with other people.
Yeah, for sure. So let's talk about being able to change that. We're mired in shame and uh, people pleasing and taking care of everybody else but ourselves. And we maybe are just coming to the recognition of that. How do you suggest that somebody gets started to making a shift?
I mean, I think, and you talk about this a lot with the people that you work with. So I'm sure listeners have heard this before. And so one of the things that I think is really important is first just recognizing that you have shame, recognizing that this is your experience. And I think if we keep resisting that, if we keep trying to absorb the narrative of fine, we're
Mhm.
never going to be able to do the other work. So then you keep chasing. I did a short the other day that talked about stop buying self help books. I had
Mhm.
a client once where I actually told her she wasn't allowed to attend any of my events. This was pre COVID when I was doing a lot more in person events. And I said, you're not allowed to come. You're doing too many things. You have a box full of resources and you're not doing anything with them. And so what ends up happening is we're fine, we're fine, we're fine, but we're not, and we know it. But I'm going to attend this wellness seminar and I'm going to be like, okay, I'm all good now because I got
Mhm.
these 5 hacks to set better boundaries and to be healthier. And you do it and then it doesn't work. And then you attend the next thing. So it's recognizing that you have this, you have shame. You are afraid that you as a person are not good enough and not worthy of love, connection, and belonging.
Mhm.
Tied with that, you exist in a culture that isn't slowing down.
Right.
So the sort of decision point then is to say, if you are okay with this being your life, turn the podcast off, never listen to you or me on our podcast or anything we do
Mhm.
again, and choose that. And then decide that you're going to be okay with that. If you're not, you have to be willing to then own the fact that you are stepping out of a bunch of salmon swimming upstream and you're going to step out of that. And it's going
Mhm.
to feel immediately like you do not have connection and belonging. Your worst fear is going to become realized.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean that that is true, but you've lived in fear for so long that you believe it to be
Mm.
true. So I
Yes.
think that's step one is just owning that, knowing that that is sort of the step forward. The second part then I think is starting to get clear on what your shame story is and where that's rooted to. And so
Mhm.
again, we can think about these bigger cultural pieces that we've had, the idea of, you should look this way, you should act this way, you should get good grades, but really thinking about for you when you felt rejection or you thought rejection was right around the corner if you didn't do X. When you experience this feeling of conditional versus unconditional love,
Mhm.
really breaking that down to get clear on when those moments happened, to recognize that that completely shifted the way you function from here on out.
Yeah.
And the reason I think that's super important is to know if I've been doing something for 25 years, it's not reasonable that some 5-step BuzzFeed article is going to make me change my boundary problems.
Right.
The reason I have problems setting boundaries is because I don't believe I'm deserving of them, not
Mhm.
because I don't know how to set a boundary.
Yeah.
And so, really getting clear on that for yourself And then I think the process starts to unfold of, okay, so now how do we rework our thoughts? And this is a big thing that you do with your clients. And I think that comes up a lot on your podcast, which is thinking about how can we have more than one story? How can we have more than one thought or truth? How do we separate out and feel our feelings, process those things? The biggest things that I work with people on then are owning radical acceptance, what we
Mhm.
can control and what we can't. And
Yes.
in that, it's a radical sense of empowerment. I can choose to spend the rest of my life, we'll use my eating disorder as an example. I could choose to spend the rest of my life dieting, restricting food, doing all of these different things. I could do that and I could figure out a way to function and be quote unquote fine.
Mhm.
At what cost? And am I okay with that? And ultimately, at that point, am I ever actually earning connection, belonging, self love, or even love from other people? Or am I basically just existing in a state of fear?
Mhm.
And so we're really getting sort of honest with ourselves about that and really thinking about, okay, is there a different thought
Mhm.
of, huh, I don't feel good in my body. That doesn't mean I'm not deserving of love. Or I don't feel like I've ever been told that my body is okay. What would that look
Mhm.
like for me to tell myself that my body is okay?
Yeah.
And I think as you start to do that, as you start to kind of tweak those thoughts and offer some different places, and again, that sort of radical empowerment, I can choose something different. What
Mhm.
ends up slowly happening if you anchor your control on, again, what you can control, letting go of what you can't, you slowly take authorship of your story.
Yeah.
Shame is going to be loud for a while you come in. And then over time, it kind of turns the dial down and you notice a shift overall.
Mhm.
So I still have days where I feel like garbage in my body, but I no longer feel like the immediate thing I have to do is go to some eating disorder thought. Now,
Mhm.
after 10 years, I can say, oh, I feel like garbage in my body today, and I feel like I can't wear these clothes. And my body is still absolutely allowed to be in public, and I can wear those clothes. I don't have to feel like my body is beautiful every day to know that my body is allowed to exist in the world as it is.
Yeah. You described it so beautifully in that process, and I know you've been through it, I've been through it. I just wanna emphasize to people that it's a process and it is challenging
Yeah.
to change that inner narrative, especially shame, right?
Yeah.
Because it thrives in the dark, and it's scary to want to release that. I think that's why it can be really helpful in what you do or what I do to have somebody to talk to about some of these things, in a
Hmm.
non-judgmental way that isn't part of your everyday life, that maybe you're not ready to talk about this with your circle of friends or family, but it's really impacting you and literally eating you from the inside out. And
Right.
so being able to acknowledge that, but then also being willing to bring it forward.
Mm.
I find that it often takes uh, an extra step, because reading a book about shame, and I love Brene Brown and all the other stuff out there, but
Yeah.
that isn't necessarily going to be what you need to release it for yourself or to work through years and years of it that has accumulated.
Well, and I think the key part for many people when you can get to a place of shame resilience, the shift is instead of it being shame-driven behaviors or shame-driven living, it's values-driven living. So
Yes.
sometimes on the outside, you might still be in that state of hustle. You might still be, I mean, I still have very big goals for my business. I have very big goals and expectations on myself based on my values as a mom or
Mhm.
about other roles. The difference is when it's from a place of my values, it's about me and what's important to me, not
Yes.
because if I don't do it, then here's all the dominoes that I think are going to fall. And so when that happens, I've been sick the last few weeks. I can still feel bummed out when I
Mhm.
don't get as many things done. I can still feel stressed when I feel like there's so many moving parts and all this stuff that I've got to take care of. But my worth as a person is no longer in jeopardy when that happens. Doesn't make that stress and chaos go away. And I'm not just like sitting on a mountaintop doing Zen meditations and breathing exercises. I'm still in the thick of the moving and the doing. I'm just not doing it for anybody else anymore. I'm
Right.
doing it based on what's important to me. And I don't now base everything about how I view myself on how someone else perceives me. So if someone does think I'm or I talk too much, or I'm gross, or whatever those fears are that you have in your head, gosh, you know what? They have every right to have that opinion. And I still can come back at the end of the day and feel okay about me honoring that, but not taking that on as now mine to fix and
Mhm.
losing myself in that process.
Right. Right. Yes. Thank you. So well said. And when you are working with clients and you talked about the values driven approach, and
Mhm.
that's something I also talk a lot about. How do you help clients to figure out what they actually value instead of the comparison and people pleasing and everything else that they've been trying to do?
So I think before we can even talk about what they want their life to look like, we have to talk about what their life has looked like.
Yeah.
So we do a lot of work up front about the now and the past and getting very clear on that and connecting their thoughts, their feelings, and their behaviors back to
Mhm.
their beliefs about themselves. And so we've done all of this to really get at this has become your barometer for what your life should look like.
Yes.
Now, what I want us to do is to just imagine who we want to be
Hmm.
and a life that we could be excited about if we were able to be that self. And so before we talk at all about what are your future goals, what do you want to do, how do you want things to change, I talk more about who would you be excited to do that work with. So I
Hmm.
think it's a big shift into thinking about, again, less about what I do and more about who I am as a person. So we do a lot of that sort of, okay, in 5 years, who's the person you'd be excited to meet? And that person isn't perfect. That person doesn't have it all figured out. That person is able to show a bit more grace. That
Hmm.
person is able to, a small thing that I've worked really hard on is my daughter's now 4. I don't want her to absorb things like road rage. Small example, but we all
Hmm.
do it. We are so mean to each other in our cars. So me now, I think it is a fair assessment. Some people are better drivers than other people. But do I deserve to be called an idiot or to call somebody else some terrible name because they didn't do the zipper the way I thought they should when they're merging? Probs not. So really working on, gosh, I don't want that to come into play. So when I can sort of think about that person, okay, so if that was me, what would need to change? What
Hmm.
is it that would look different? What's the value that would drive that? And so, really, as you start to think about the person you'd be excited to be, people will say things like, I wouldn't be afraid to make a decision.
Hmm.
I wouldn't be afraid to tell somebody how I feel. I would go for this. I would change careers. That
Hmm.
person would be doing something different. That person would be able to be, I'd be more spontaneous, whatever that is. They start to explore that because we're just brainstorming. Once we do that and we connect back to, okay, why would they do that? Why is spontaneity important? Well,
Hmm.
because if everything is always scheduled, it feels like you never get a moment to breathe and all you're doing is thinking about what you're doing. Okay, interesting. Let's walk that back even more. So what are we doing right now that's perpetuating that? How
Hmm.
would that look in a small step?
Yeah.
Is it scheduling an hour once a week where we have nothing planned? Is it waiting for the elevator and you don't take your phone out? Like, what does that look like to allow those moments where there isn't something filling that? And then we expand it back into that's what that person would do. And it's sort of trying on this idea. And I think once people do that and we walk it back to the value, and then from there we walk it back to the action,
Yeah.
what ends up happening too is now they've created buy in.
Hmm.
It's not just me saying, well, you need to stop, doing blank, or them assuming, well, I should go do this, or I need to set better boundaries here. They've now created this idea of when I set those boundaries, this person gets to emerge. And
Hmm.
I think it was Mel Robbins who coined the phrase, but I'm not totally sure. But the idea of an anchor thought, it comes up a lot
Hmm.
in psychology, but the idea of I'm going to do this shitty thing because this thing comes through on the other side.
Yeah.
That buy in then helps set the stage for them to do all that hard work and to tolerate that short term distress
Yes.
for the long term gain.
Right. And I find too, with the values based approach, then moving forward, not just with setting boundaries, but even making decisions, when you're anchored into here's what's really important. You
Right.
don't have that internal struggle as much about, do I need to make these extra cookies for the bake sale
Right.
or volunteer to do this extra project?
Yes.
When you're clued in, it's that guilt isn't there. It's like, nope, that's just not going to work for me. And
Right.
so it it is work up front, but can really help with the moving forward as that person that you want to be. And that person is generally more confident, more decisive,
Right.
and feeling more in control and empowered, all of those things versus serving other people and being lost in the
Right.
process.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. So when clients come to you and they've identified, like, hey, I really feel like I am on the verge of burnout, what are some things that they are doing initially? So we know that they're working with you in a series, but are there any things that you can suggest even for our listeners at home, like for them, that one or two steps that they
Mm.
could do on their own?
So I do two things up front with people. First is a problem dump. And one of the things that I think is super helpful is to realize, just take some time and name everything that you're upset about,
Mhm,
everything that you're feeling frustrated about, everything that you're feeling overwhelmed with, just getting it all out on paper. We know that the process of externalization sort of removes some of the power of what it's doing in our head. So I'll do this even before I do a speaking event, and we've got, a few hundred people on this call. We all take a moment and we write down every single thing that our brain is trying to bring into our hour together, and we put it down on a piece of paper. So
mhm,
I think that's a skill that can be super helpful for you as you're first trying to figure out what the problem is, where you're trying to go, what you need, what you're longing for, but it's also a great daily ritual to get into where you're releasing those thoughts. In acceptance and commitment therapy, it's a process called cognitive diffusion, which is
mhm,
basically the idea of defusing or detaching yourself from your thoughts as being sort of the marker, the guidepost. So when you do that and you start to get all those thoughts out and you can practice the art of sort of releasing them, at least for the moment, it gives you that small sense of power. It also helps the thoughts not feel so big. And the more you do it, the more you can start to see the themes. Gosh, if every night you're going to bed with the same four stories about yourself, okay, that gives you some insight as to where you might need to center some of your work. So I think that's one thing that people can do, because a lot of us know we don't like how we're feeling, but we don't really know why. So, really understanding that when people come to me, that's a lot of the conversation point of, I hear you. This sucks. Why do you care enough to do the sucky work to change it? And that really helps, because the more you get clear on it and you recognize, I don't like this.
yeah,
I don't like that every single day I'm going to bed feeling like I'm a bad mom. I don't feel like every single day I leave work feeling like I didn't get enough done, and I'm laying in bed at night thinking about it. If we
mhm,
go under that, it's, why is it that you are never doing enough? What is that piece? And we can really dissect it. So I think that's one thing that people can do. One of the other things that is really helpful upfront too is that sort of the combating of shame is to talk about it, to bring light to it.
yeah,
Not everybody's gonna be ready to be like, "Here, sit down. Let me tell you. I've got this thing. It's called shame, and it basically means I'm afraid you're gonna reject me. So let me tell you about all the things that I'm thinking about and see if you reject me."
yeah,
That won't happen. But we do know that a gratitude practice is one of the best ways to decenter ourselves from our ego and our shame stories and expand back out. So when someone says, like, would you ever talk that way to someone else as you do to yourself? You're like, of course not. I would never say those things to someone else. I would never tell someone that they couldn't wear that shirt because they're too fat. I would never tell someone that they are a garbage human because they didn't do these 6 things on their to do list. I would probably be telling them they're doing too much.
mhm,
The same thing comes true through a gratitude practice. So, starting to think about something that you are grateful for, someone that you are grateful for. And if you can do it, the second part is more tricky for people. In tandem with that, something you're proud of yourself for that day.
yeah,
So, really starting that art or that practice of, what can you see outside of yourself? And then also, what can you say to yourself that hasn't, it doesn't mean the day is an entire zero. And you
mhm,
might still go to bed with that problem list and everything else and saying, well, 99% of the day was crap.
mhm,
But is there a way you can give yourself a 1%? And I think both of those sort of as daily rituals, the brain dumping and then the gratitude and the self celebration, are little tricks and tips that just start changing the momentum of the thoughts enough that you can kind of pry open the door and start doing some of that deeper work when you're ready.
Mhm. Yes, and I know from the people I work with and on this podcast too, that finding the one good thing to be proud of about yourself can sometimes be really, really difficult, and
Impossible. Yeah.
because we're hard on ourselves and
Mhm.
we are skewed negative, but it's also really important to make some time to do that and give yourself a pat on the back every once in a while. Like,
Mhm.
hey, I made dinner 5 nights in a row this week. It doesn't have
Mhm.
to be this big thing. It might be I made dinner 1 night this week, but to just not dismiss everything you do, because that just adds into that whole comparison shame spiral, everything else too. So
And
thank
sometimes
you.
if you don't have something, purely say, "I'm here right now.
Mhm.
I'm trying this." That
Yes.
is a win, even if you can't come up with another
Mhm.
win. The fact that you're willing to try it, because a lot of people aren't. They're
Yes.
talking themselves out of doing that. They don't have the time. They still have to stay on the hustle train. The fact that you're pausing long enough to even consider something that you can celebrate for yourself is a win.
Yes. I love that. Well, this has been a fantastic conversation. Thank you so much for joining us. Where can people find you? We have a lot of commonalities in what we talk about. So I know you have a podcast as well. Can you talk a little bit about that and where else people can find you to learn more about you, follow you, or
Yeah,
your programs?
absolutely. So I would say the best place to go just in general is my website. So it's adversityrising.com. And from there, you can find a link to my YouTube channel where I post more actionable videos on something that we can do, some sort of problem based thing. And I think it's really helpful for people maybe as they're starting to consider what a different way of healing can look like instead of just trying to do more and solve it, but really giving that space and grace for that deeper processing. Otherwise, there's also a link there to my podcast, the Untethering Shame podcast. And really, there, what we're doing is building community by sharing different people's stories and really expanding out that your story is completely different from someone else's story. And those underlying thoughts and feelings are what bind us. And if we can get to that place and build community around the healing, the changing, the evolution we want to see there, that's really where we're going to find that momentum shift away from a culture of burnout. So you can find links to both of those things. You can also check out some of my other programs, ways that I work with people, either in a one on one setting or in my larger group programming, or hop on my email list and get a weekly email that kind of delivers sort of a process of doing some of this work over the course of about a year and a half. So you get a weekly email that helps you start to kind of build some of that momentum just in
Mhm.
a very easy and free space with an invitation to spend 15, 20 minutes a week sort of doing the work as you're preparing and maybe considering doing something more.
Yes. Well, wonderful. And that's adversityrising.com. I will, of course, link that in the show notes as well. And I want to say thank you again for your time today and sharing your expertise. I know that this is really something that is so prevalent in our culture, as we discussed. And so it's a really important conversation. I'm glad we could shed some light on that, as well as just trying to normalize the conversation that you're not alone
Right,
and you can work through some of these things either on your own or with support,
right.
but it doesn't have to stay this way.
Absolutely.
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 All right, listeners, thank you so much. And I will be back with another episode next week. Thank you for listening to the Stop Overthinking podcast with Kristen Odegaard. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with someone else who would benefit from the message. To learn more about working with me and links to social media and free resources, head over to my website, coachwithkristen.com. That's Kristen spelled Kristen. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss future episodes. Have a great week.